Hello, college football fans, and welcome to the second episode of College Football Throwdown. I am your co-host, Alex Schmitz, and today I am joined by my dad, Peter Schmitz.
Hello.
For those of you who didn't listen to our pilot episode, we are a podcast that is all about college football, a podcast for college football fans by college football fans, and we want to keep our discussions progressing from the national level to the conference level, in our case specifically the Big Ten, due to our affiliation with Nebraska football, which would be the third level of conversation that we want to get into. So we hope to address all three of these levels of college football every week, based on the news that's come out, and talk about the sport that we love.
Outstanding.
Yes. And since the last podcast, we found a website to host it on, podomatic.com. If you go to footballthrowdown.podomatic.com, you can find our website and where these podcasts will be uploaded. We also have an iTunes page, College Football Throwdown. You can find our episodes there as well, if that's your preferred method of listening to podcasts. And you can email us, if you'd like to email us any questions, at huskerpete13@gmail.com. That's huskerpete13@gmail.com. All right. So we're going to dive into the national topics to start with today, and one of them that we wanted to talk about was the recent, what do we want to say?
Well, the recent decision regarding the proposal for early signing. There was a proposal that was being considered to add a early signing day to college football, much like is done in a number of other NCAA-sanctioned sports, like basketball. Of course, you're familiar with that one. But even some of the other lesser sports have two signing periods as well. So the idea that the main sport activity of football, which brings in a lot of money and revenue and interest, doesn't have that two signing periods, actually makes it more unique, if you will, among NCAA sports.
Mm-hmm. Right, and you were talking about actually how the Nebraska football program's former coach, Bo Pelini, actually had a more radical idea for recruiting periods that players should just be allowed to sign at any time.
Right. Versus
this is more of a
this discussion
compromise.
Just began, which was it's been kind of in the consciousness for years, but it really started to gain momentum about a year and a half ago. I'd say 18 months ago or whatever, and fairly early on in that dialogue where it became a national conversation with talk radio and such. One of the people that kind of threw out the other alternative idea was Bo, actually, and he proposed that actually the heck with an early signing period. What would be preferred in his mind was to go ahead and have the ability for players or athletes to sign a letter of intent whenever they wanted, with certain very simple stipulations. You would want to make sure that you alleviated any recruiting weekend or visit high, so to speak, and force them to take, say, 72 hours after their recruiting visit before they could make a final decision and sign a document that was in any way binding for them and committing them to a particular school. But his idea was effectively the immediate signing opportunity, where if a player went to a particular school and enjoyed the visit, found that school had everything that they were looking for and was certain that was the school that they wanted to go to, that they could just go ahead and finish the process and say yes and physically sign a letter of intent and be done with it, so that they didn't have to deal with all of this constant continued recruiting on the off chance that just maybe there's a 1% chance that they're going to change their mind. If they're one of the premier, say, 200, 250 athletes in the country that are highly pursued by large numbers of schools, that tends to get taxing on kids. They don't even realize it, I think, and then it just kind of sucks them in. And then those last few weeks or even months before signing day, can't get there fast enough because they just get overwhelmed and almost exhausted by the process. And so you could eliminate a lot of that. And then the counter side to that, which was kind of one of Bo's main points in his proposal, was, let's get rid of this so that all these superficial offers that tend to happen where universities, even like Nebraska or any major university, they often will offer hundreds of players when none of them supposedly have more than 25 scholarships to offer. It seems kind of silly that so many offers are being extended. Well, that's because you don't know who's going to say yes and who's going to say no. And they're extending offers to a lot of players that, frankly, if they had said immediately yes at the time that the offer was extended, they would then learn that, well, that wasn't really a committable offer, which is now a new term in the lexicon of recruiting, is the offer a committable offer or not? So basically they're trying to play the cat and mouse game, just like the athletes have converted the word commitment into reservation, as you and I have talked on many occasions. So all this discussion with the NCAA was intended to kind of get back around to the early signing period, an early signing period that would have occurred in December, which effectively was about a month or maybe 5 weeks ahead, 6 weeks ahead of the signing day. Now there are arguments to be made to say that sounds stupid. Why would you put a signing date that was just 6 weeks ahead of the other one? That's just going to accelerate, and the December date would become the de facto signing day, because most players would end up signing then, and most coaches and teams would strive to get all of their athletes that they had committed up to that point to sign in December. They wouldn't want anybody trailing along and not signing at that point in time, right? The ones they wanted, they would want to secure right there so that it was over.
Although, as we discussed, it's possible that could be like something to help the recruiters, in that if you don't sign with us in December, then you sort of start to become a little bit more aware of that player and are like, okay, maybe they're not as committed to us as we thought. We should look for someone else to maybe take his place.
Right. You kind of expose the people who are not fully on board, and they're forced to kind of show their cards a little bit with regard to, you might call it the shit or get off the pot, provision of the process. But the bottom line, though, is that vote did occur through the NCAA committee, and they decided to postpone any action on it for at least another year. So it's definitely not going to happen this year, and I wonder, based on their vote, whether that will cause it to kind of lose a little bit of momentum, or at least maybe force it to go get revisited and maybe redefined. I think there's a stronger argument to be made that if you're going to have an early signing period, that you would have it quite a bit earlier, that you might have it after say about the first third of the high school football season. So it would maybe happen in mid-September, like from September 15th to the 25th would be the 10-day window for early signing, so that anybody who had gone through a lot of visitations and stuff through the summer would and was pretty sure that what they wanted, and then you give them a little bit of time to kind of reconnect and get into their high school football season, and then they would be able to make it final if they wanted to.
So you kind of think it might almost have a better chance of going through if it goes for more extreme change versus the simple 6-week jump?
Yes, I do. I think that what they would want to do is try to create a little bit more of a gap between that day and the day of the ultimate signing, so that people could, or I should say coaches and teams, could kind of reset, and they would know where they're at. Which kids actually signed with them, which ones didn't, and because of which ones signed and didn't sign at all the other schools, you'd know what the pool of available top talent was at that point. You'd know that probably 80% of the top 400 players in the country, as ranked by these ranking services, would probably be committed and then signed. So all those guys are off the board, and now you're fighting over 20-25% of the athletes for the remainder of that time, and then exposing any late bloomers from from their senior seasons, guys who came on strong as seniors but maybe weren't in the picture before that.
Right. Although, if the backside, or the repercussion, I should say, of that decision would be that would make the earlier aggressing or earlier recruiting all the more aggressive, because now instead of them signing in, like, what was it now, February? Instead of them signing in February, now they're signing in September. So now the recruiters are trying to drive a commitment even earlier than they have been before.
Correct. Which leads to the whole issue, which we'll talk about more, I'm sure, not only on this podcast but in future podcasts, because I think it's one of the major issues here, and that is the issue of official visits versus unofficial visits. And a lot of this stuff all ties together because it's all about leverages and advantages that one school or group of schools has over another group of schools, and what are the rules going to be that are going to govern the entire sport. And they have so many rules, and yet there are some of these circumstances that create massive inequities. And as the dynamics of this process change, they need to change the rules to anticipate those new realities. And that's why this subject is even coming up now, as opposed to having come up years ago. It would have been a non-issue, 25, 30 years ago, because people weren't recruiting that early. Coaches didn't even focus on that until, during their senior seasons and things of that nature. Now this whole recruiting process has gotten so accelerated.
So did that shift come about like during the early 2000s?
No. It was before that. That. I would suggest that it probably began to happen, but not across the board. It started to happen at some premier schools in the 80s, like the late 1980s, and then just progressed through the 90s. By the mid 90s, it was full blown going at that point. What is now Rivals and networks like that didn't exist back in that time frame. The internet didn't exist, but for example, the one that I followed, that's been around for many, many years, at that time was just a published magazine. Okay, it was just a paper magazine that I would receive in the mail once a week, called Huskers Illustrated. It still exists today. Okay, and that Huskers Illustrated had an 800 number, and you could call the 800 number and you would pay money. It was like a 900 number type of thing, where you would pay $2 a minute or whatever to listen to updates about who was interested and who was signing and all that sort of stuff, before there was ever the internet.
Yeah, that's a blast from the past for sure.
Yeah.
Goodness.
And I will admit to have been a subscriber to all that. And I can remember the old days of when all you could do was connect up with a modem and a baud rate of 28.8 or whatever, and I would hook up to be able to go online and be able to get the initial updates from those kinds of things. What is now Rivals and 24/7 and ESPN 300 and all those different websites. That was the precursor to all of them. They had magazines that came out. It was all paper back then. So
now, I think before we move on to our next national discussion, we need to crack our beer, as is our tradition.
This is our tradition that we've created for this. So we can't do this without having some beverage, so it's probably necessary to do that. There we go. Now we're talking. Now the ball's really rolling.
That's right.
Okay.
Yes. And the next topic we wanted to discuss are the kind of a hot topic issue right now within college football, the satellite camps that a lot of the schools have been participating in.
Right. So to kind of lay the groundwork on this, of course, basically there are some conferences that allow, and it's legal for teams to have satellite camps, and other schools where it is not legal to do that. Specifically, the SEC and the ACC do not have the ability to have satellite camps. They have rules against the participation in that. And but then there's a lot of other of the Power 5 conferences and other conferences that don't have a rule against that. And so there has kind of been a recognition here that, hey, let's go where the athletes live, right? And why wouldn't we go down there into those athlete-rich areas and see if we can expand the exposure? And I think it's indelibly linked to the issue of official visits, and I'll retouch that issue, that those things are linked, in my opinion. One of the reasons why there is a stronger motivation by schools who are not in the athlete-rich areas of the country and high population areas of the country want to go down there is obviously they want access to those athletes. They want to be able to build relationships with those athletes. And a satellite camp, which is basically taking the show on the road, taking your coaching staff and other staff members down to a location, either entering into a relationship with a smaller university or high school that's already holding a camp, or creating one in a joint venture type of arrangement with somebody down in that area, and then promoting it and driving traffic and sign-ups to it so that you can get exposure to some athletes. And that basically allows you to get exposure to those kids and have those kids come and get coached by your staff in situations where those same players would not be able, they wouldn't be able to afford it. They wouldn't be able to have the time because it wouldn't be in proximity. They wouldn't be able to go all the way to Lincoln, Nebraska, for example, in Nebraska's case, to visit the campus and to be coached by our staff. By traveling on the road and going down there to those regions, the University of Nebraska is able to introduce itself to players that they wouldn't normally be able to do. Go ahead.
It's true, and it is particularly beneficial to smaller schools like Nebraska that don't have the population nearby and don't have the athletes just walking in the door on unofficial visits.
Right.
But then there are schools like Michigan, obviously gets a fair amount of unofficial visits, has lots of athletes in their backyard, and they're still being very aggressive with the satellite camps.
Correct. And the reality is yes, you're right. Michigan has a lot more access to athletes than, say, a Nebraska or an Iowa or maybe even a Minnesota. But Michigan recognizes the value of still getting their national brand, of U of M football into the center of these really rich areas of college football. And if you can build some relationships or identify some athletes that you wouldn't have otherwise found, well, that's a huge plus, right? Mm-hmm. And that makes it really easy to justify all the expenditures. I mean, it's not cheap to do that. And it's interesting. We've obviously done a little bit of reading on this before the podcast here, and one of the interesting articles was one that was actually written by the Cane Sport website that promotes or supports the Miami Hurricanes, and they were writing specifically about the implications of Nebraska being at Florida A&M University, where they had one of their satellite camps, and they had 400 campers there, and a number of kids, including 2 or 3 that Nebraska was able to observe in the various drills that were going on as part of the camp, and immediately offered 3 or 4 of those players scholarship offers just based on what the coaches were able to see of those athletes during the day and a half of their camping activity. So that's a big deal. And so, of course, a Michigan or any school would say there's value in doing that. Now, the question is, it's not equal, right? It's way more beneficial for Nebraska to go south and to get all this exposure that they normally wouldn't get. So they're really motivated to do this, right? Whereas, say, a Florida, a University of Florida, or a Miami. In fact, one of the quotes in this article was directly from Miami's coach, Al Golden, who expressed the concern that he couldn't imagine leaving his campus for a week to go to satellite camps because of all the official or all the unofficial visits that he would miss during the course of just 1 week of time, because so many athletes were coming to visit his school all the time. Now, I'm here to tell you, in any given week, if Nebraska has 3 or 4 or 5 kids unofficially visiting, other than Nebraska kids and kids from the general, what we would call 500 or even 200 mile radius of Lincoln, 1 day's drive type of thing. That would be a huge number, 5 or 6. And Al Golden is saying, I can't afford to miss a week because there's so many of them. I would miss all these players, right?
Which is a great microcosm of the discrepancy between these different schools,
Right.
just the disadvantage that a school like Nebraska is working against in the recruiting game just because they don't have that kind of talent
Now,
literally walking in the door.
right now, before we sound too woe is us, okay, with this, the fact is that it is what it is, and but I think the solution is some combination of some kind of rules that govern how the satellite camp arrangement might work that was reasonable and not doesn't create a free for all, and two, that it maybe increases the awareness and discussion about providing official visits. I think providing official visits and early as early as maybe the second semester of a player's junior year might make a lot of sense and might address some of these concerns that these smaller population schools might have. Because it would allow them to obviously select and target athletes that they were interested in for a formal invitation to the campus earlier so that they could have conversation and build relationships and in fact get with their parents. So again, there's all kinds of issues I just mentioned there. The early recruits, the early visits, making the visits include parents, which currently it does not. Being able to pay for the parents to come is, in my opinion, a necessary step that the NCAA should do no matter what else they ever do. They've got to get parents on with those kids, just period. That's just stupid that they don't. And it really hurts, I think, the types of decisions that the players make and the kind of shenanigans that goes on. I think some of this shenanigans that goes on where kids are playing coaches off each other and they're trying to create the best possible set of opportunities. And frankly, they're going up there to party without mom and dad in their shadow for a weekend is a big problem. And they could address that by opening the door to pay for the parents so the parents aren't having to foot their own bill.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that would definitely be a help, particularly to any schools that are really trying to pitch the student athlete
Right.
side of their program, and showing how the college is going to make their son into a good young man, and working adult, that sort of thing.
Right. Well, it just allows them to sell the program to the people who are likely, in most cases, the biggest part of the decision making group in a given family. So sometimes it's just the kid making the decision, but you'd like to think that the parents' opinion is going to matter to some degree, if not to a large degree, in the decision process that the kids make.
Mm-hmm. Although another part of this discussion is that the schools that are currently not doing these satellite camps are the SEC and the ACC because it's against their conference rules, but they've already said that they are going to petition the NCAA to change the rules about these camps, and if the rules aren't changed, then they're going to join the fray, so to speak, by next year.
Right.
And while a school like Nebraska might maintain a certain advantage because our coach has experience with these camps in the past at Oregon State, and we're getting excited about doing them and all that for now, within a couple of years, if the likes of Alabama and Florida and Miami start going to these same camps that we're going to in Florida and Alabama and such, and start trying to keep the talent that they have in their state and trying to defend their territory, as it were, from the outside coaches, then the impact of the camps, the positive impact of the camps for the more northern schools would be significantly lessened.
Absolutely. And there are so many complicating factors. If this becomes a free-for-all, you could see all the negative things. Bottom line is, one of the biggest advantages of the satellite camps is this is supposed to be kind of a quiet period. You're not supposed to be able to go out and visit athletes during this period of time. Okay, it's not an active recruiting period where they can go on the road and be directly recruiting athletes. Okay, so there is an exception for instruction for camps. There's a specific exception for that, and so it opens the door to all kinds of additional recruiting and stuff that they were trying to protect, so that they could protect the kids, the young athletes, summer, right, and so that they're not getting consumed into the recruiting process so enormously at that point, and it's also trying to protect the coaches from themselves. And the fact that they they're a paranoid bunch and they're an intensely competitive bunch. So they're going to always assume somebody else is out recruiting them. So they're going to make sure that that never happens. So they won't sleep because they're going to be trying to, recruit.
Right.
And so if you don't have these quiet periods and such during the course of a year and have certain rules about the recruiting season, they'd be doing it all the time. And satellite camps right now is being exposed as kind of an end around, a loophole, if you will, within the system that gives you the opportunity to have those conversations and build those relationships.
And if the camps became like a free-for-all, it'd be interesting to see what sort of power that would give to the people who are actually running these camps, because now there's intense competition from a number of schools and a number of coaching staffs who want to hold these camps at their universities, at their high schools or whatever, and now they get to weed through the ones who they want to get in, who are willing to pay them the most or offer them the best deal or whatever, and maybe the prices for the camps will go up because they'll realize that these kids are getting really valuable instruction from a bunch of professional level coaches,
Right. Right. Yeah, so there's a bunch of things. And so, I think there's some leverage points there. I hope that it ends in dialogue at the NCAA level to standardize the rules, and that it includes some dialogue about getting official visits moved up into that junior year or second semester of junior year so that these smaller population area schools have at least the chance to build relationships with these athletes before they make their decision.
Right. Although that does then have the implication of the fact that schools like Alabama and a lot of the ones in the SEC really don't want that to happen, because then that forces them to use their own official visits, whereas right now they can just rely on the fact that a bunch of kids are going to show up at their doorstep during the summer on unofficial visits, and they don't have to pay for them.
Right.
And they'll come in and get the whole tour and all that.
And build relationships.
Whereas if the rules change and Nebraska is paying for kids to come see Nebraska and giving them the ritzy, showroom
tour,
during that same period, now those kids are going to be asking for the same thing from Alabama.
Right.
When they didn't have to do that before.
Absolutely true. And all legitimate reasons why they wouldn't want this to happen. But at the same time, I think from an equity standpoint, as at the NCAA level, they're going to have to try to figure out a way to do that, or somehow, some other way, slow down the access to athletes that the local areas, the local schools have with these athletes in some way, so that they're not able to basically be gobbling up by building these deepened relationships with them before the other schools even really get a chance to get them to campus.
Exactly.
It's too unfair, and they know it. So I think at some point, cooler heads need to prevail in that, or it's going to create a disparity within the sport that will make it kind of boring, because it'll become a very regional sport again.
Mm-hmm.
So
which they do want to avoid for
Right.
the purposes of TV contracts
Absolutely.
and everything.
Absolutely.
There's certainly money incentive.
So anyway, to kind of summarize on that, then this satellite camp is a fascinating thing. I mean, Michigan's done it. Harbaugh's made big news this summer on it. The coach at Michigan, certainly. Nebraska's had some great success with it, and we'll talk about that in just a second. Yeah, Colorado's been doing it. Wisconsin did it. Even Ohio State, I think, had a few camps.
Yeah,
so it's everybody in the northern regions is doing it.
And even the Pac-12 too.
And throughout the Pac-12, they've been doing it for a few years out there, but within their own conference, where almost everybody had some kind of a satellite camp in the state of California, for example.
Right.
So anyway, fascinating stuff. Will be interesting to see in the background, what's happening over the course of the season, the stuff that's not going on the field over the course of the season. There's going to be an awful lot of positioning and posturing going on among the Power 5 conference commissioners and individual athletic directors to impose their influence on some of these very important issues.
Mm-hmm.
Let's jump real quickly into the Nebraska aspect of the satellite camps. For those on the podcast who might enjoy the Nebraska aspect of this, we just completed a week in which we were scheduled to do 5 satellite camps. Ended up only doing 4 because one was kind of canceled due to weather but they were able to hit Georgia, Atlanta, Georgia, Miami, Florida, Dallas, and Los Angeles. So they were able to hit some of the key recruiting, bastions that they've been targeting, and they were able to get exposure to, some estimates of 800 plus, maybe even 1,000 athletes that they were able to see and evaluate. And they extended offers to players that were going all the way out to 2018. So, kids that are going into their sophomore year were getting scholarship offers from Nebraska. And, so that's a big deal.
They're going into their sophomore year?
Yeah, they're going into their sophomore year. They're going to be 2018.
Sheesh.
Well, one kid down in at the camp in Miami showed tremendous skills and ran some crazy sub 4.4 speed and already had some good length to him and looked to be a future star as a cornerback and already had the athleticism and everything like that. Never seen him before, didn't know who he was, and before the camp ended, we offered him a scholarship. So it's that one of those things where it's his skills just jumped so clearly off the field
mm-hmm.
that they couldn't say no,
Right.
And so that's the kind of cool stuff where a kid like that who's not gotten any exposure might get some exposure. There were also seniors, kids who were going into their senior year that didn't have any exposure that now have a scholarship offer and aren't even ranked by the rivals and the 247s and those kinds of folks, scout.com.
Right, because as we talked about, the rivals rankings are a little bit biased in that they specifically focus on the athletes who come to their rivals' camps, where their people can be there evaluating the talent and all of that.
Yeah.
And so a lot of the kids who either don't have the time or the money or whatever it may be to go to those camps don't get represented as well.
Yeah, exactly. It's not that that's the only thing that those evaluating organizations do. It's just
Right.
one of the elements that they use. It just tends to be an element that becomes rather significant in where the ranking is. And so since those rankings have become so important to measuring whether your head coach is doing a good job or not, because for whatever reason we are easily, as a public, willing to defer a level of expertise upon these groups that whether it's earned or not, we have no idea. It's not like I know the credentials of all the talent evaluators that work for rivals, but does everybody believe those rankings? You darn right they believe them, and they use them, and so that is a measure of whether or not a program is healthy or not.
Right.
Now the reality is that the data says, generally speaking, if you have higher ranked recruiting classes according to these kinds of services, you're going to be more likely to win a lot of games and have a chance at championships. That is a fact. So it's not like it's totally out the left window that
Mm-hmm.
these rankings don't matter. They do matter. But it's just that there's also a lot of athletes that fall outside of those rankings that can also end up being very, very good talents. And so at some point, there needs to be a fallback to the old days where you have to trust that your coaching staff has a certain capability at evaluating talent, and you have to believe in that coach's or that staff's ability to not only evaluate talent but identify the ones that are going to fit their system, and then go out and effectively recruit them, get them interested in your school, and get them there.
Right.
But again, that's a big long discussion, so we won't go there right now. Now we did actually already get a couple of emails from some listeners that were kind enough to give us a little bit of their time off the first podcast.
That's right. On that website I referenced before, footballthrowdown.podomatic.com, there's pages for each individual episode. And so on the page for the first episode, we had a fan named AJ who said, "Love the media bias discussion. I would like to hear Alex's point of view on if college football can be saved from becoming the minor leagues for the NFL." So in terms of that, there's been a lot of discussion in recent years about whether college football athletes should be paid, since universities, particularly in the case of the star players, are selling their jersey numbers, or merchandise centered around them in whatever way, to make thousands of dollars, for the university or for the sports program, and those players aren't seeing a cent of that. And so there's some discussion as to whether that's fair or not, or whether football players should be given like a stipend amount in order to pay for just general living expenses of like buying food for your apartment or going out to eat with your girlfriend, that sort of thing, which is getting to the whole complexity of whether these people are student athletes or whether they're, paid
semi-pro.
Semi-pro players, which the people who are, it's mostly the biggest factor for it is, of course, for the star athletes, who have the legitimate case to make that they are contributing this money to the university, through their own performance on the field, which is a very small fraction of the overall, college football player base. So I don't think it's fair to base all that discussion around just the top tier athletes, but it's an interesting debate to be having, certainly, as well as the fact that, I think it's good that college football, unlike basketball or other sports, you have to go through at least your junior year of college before you can make it into the NFL, whereas with basketball, you can get into the NBA right out of high school.
I know, it's after 1 year of college.
Oh, is it 1 year of college?
1 year, yeah.
Okay.
In basketball.
But the point is that with college football, it comes to be an interesting time whenever you have a player who reaches their junior year and they've been a successful player and have that potential to be drafted in the NFL. What do they choose to do? Do they choose to take that opportunity and that money and seize it, or do they decide to stick with their team, or stay to get their degree or whatever the case may be? And I personally always have a large respect for the players that choose to stick around for their senior year because they care about their team, or because they really want to win that championship, or because they want to get their bachelor's degree or what have you. I've always found that is a admirable trait. Now, of course, there's a variety of reasons why an athlete might choose to take their junior year, because of a fear of injury in their senior year, or because of just the amount of money being waved in their face, and because of their own financial circumstances, whatever they may be. There are a multitude of reasons why it would be completely legitimate to choose to go your junior year. But personally, I've always found that the more that college football can be made a place for the student athlete versus a place for the semi-pro, NFL to be kind of player, I think the former is the type of college football that I would like to see. Right.
Well, now, how does that tie in, though? Here, let me try to address the question about the media bias and how that ties in with the minor league for the NFL. The issue with the media bias is that it already that college football has evolved from being a sport that was covered for the love of the game, and it was covered maybe with a bias to individual conferences and that sort of stuff, to where now there's so much attention given to the players, and stars are born every weekend from the beginning of their freshman year, and now even in high school, ESPN has gotten into televising high school football games. So the whole star aspect is just getting pushed earlier and earlier and earlier. And then once they latch on to those athletes, the ESPNs, the Big Ten networks, the Fox Sports networks of the world, NBC Sports, all of those organizations, they latch on to those big names, whether it's Jameis Winston or whoever, Johnny Manziel from a few years ago. The media latches onto them and makes these guys superstars, okay, and is immediately already projecting them into the NFL and saying, where will they fit, how are they going to do, et cetera, et cetera. And so it creates an environment where that's what the kids grow up watching, right? And so it's going to motivate and continue to move in the same direction, that kids come into the program in college already thinking about this being a stepping stone to their next step, which of course is the NFL. And coaches have stopped telling the reality of the situation because their peer coaches are bragging about, I can get you to the NFL. And now that that has become a proven effective message on the recruiting trail, very few coaches are willing to up front tell people the truth, which is, less than 3% of you guys are going to end up in the NFL. Okay, very few, and those that do get there are on average going to be there about 3 or 3.5 years. That's the number, and even a fewer fraction of those are going to actually make enough money during their pro career to be life-changing type money. So when you shrink it down to the ones that are going to get that life-changing money versus the number that actually enter college football, it's such a teeny tiny percentage, and yet a bunch of kids go into their college years now with the presumption that I'm going to be one of those select few. I'm going to be one of those that's good enough, okay? And the coaches aren't dispelling that, because in fact they're kind of encouraging it, and then they're pointing at the pictures on the wall of the players that have come through their program and have achieved that level of success, right? And so the media bias thing ends up just driving the train towards more and more of a shift in focus from I want to play for State U. When I grew up, for example, in Nebraska in the 70s, I dreamed, and while I played football, I dreamed of playing football at the University of Nebraska. It really didn't occur to me that much. It was a much more of a secondary thought that I dreamed of playing in the NFL or that I would play as a professional. But the idea that I might be able to play college football was something that I viewed as possible, and certainly my ultimate dream of that would have been to play for the U, right? The University of Nebraska down in Lincoln. So that whole focus has obviously shifted over those years, and so many of the kids now don't have that loyalty to program. They now have the loyalty to themselves, and that is a major dynamic change.
Yeah, well, and in terms of what you were saying about just the oversaturation of media attention and getting back to the rivals ratings discussion, there have been multiple examples both within Nebraska and within other schools, cases where like a 5-star athlete who's supposed to be, the best of the best or whatever, arrives to campus and for whatever reason they don't perform at the level you expect them to, and that might be for a number of reasons, because they've been playing at such a high level compared to everyone else just due to their physical talents in high school that they never needed to try hard, and now they finally get to college and they do have to train hard and play hard in order to compete at that level, and suddenly they find that they don't have the fortitude either physically or mentally to deal with that, or their heads just get so inflated because of all the coverage they're getting, as high school students, and all the hype and the, honey-tongued coaches who are coming to recruit them, telling them how great they are, that can have a bad effect on their mental state, especially if they come to college and all of a sudden they're the big man on campus because they're the star recruit.
They lose the hunger.
Exactly.
Yep,
so I think there needs to be some amount of that, that, like you said, the feeling of like, I need to work hard to be able to play for this college that I love. Right. That sort of mentality, I think, is something that is good to cultivate within the players to keep them on the straight and narrow towards both being a good football player and, hopefully getting a college degree if they're not the 3% that makes it to the NFL.
Right. And exactly. And so I guess bottom line is I think your summation there is you don't like that trend, and to answer AJ's question here is your opinion is it's not a good thing for the sport that we are moving in that direction, and things that we might be able to do to change that direction would be good ideas, and maybe that's a subject for a future podcast for us if we continue to have success with this. And that's one thing I probably should mention. I'll have you go through these sites again to give everybody another chance to hear those. But also, the whole point of our podcast here is to kind of put on record in a real recording the conversations that have long been a part of Alex, you and I's conversations as you grew up. To just kind of hang around and enjoy each other's company and share something that we both love, and so these conversations tended to kind of wind and go off topic every now and then. And we felt that a podcast that kind of captured that might be fun for people to listen to when they're not having to worry too much about anything else when they're mowing a lawn or whatever.
Right.
So that it's just kind of fun to do that. So it's not necessarily as structured as maybe some other podcasts where they're kind of hitting the bullets fast.
Oh yeah, no, I did some podcasts while I was down at college, and our motto was always that it was a conversational podcast, and so we would sometimes go off on tangents and let the conversation wander a bit, but that usually led to something either funny or interesting, that you might not get from a podcast that was more, just going straight down what the topics were.
Right.
And for those who are interested, I'm going to repeat it again. Website for our podcast is footballthrowdown.podomatic.com, or you can visit us on iTunes, Football Throwdown, College Football Throwdown on iTunes, or email us at huskerpete13@gmail.com, both in terms of questions you might have for the podcast as well as any sort of constructive criticism on what could be done to improve the podcast. We're always willing to hear from you guys about that sort of thing.
So please don't hesitate.
That's right.
Okay, so let's see here. We got another piece of mail
Yes.
after the first podcast, which was nice. And this piece came from Steve. I believe he's down in Arkansas. And okay, yes, sir. Got to put the mouth by the microphone.
That's right.
Okay. He said, my question for the show is, do you think our defensive tackle tandem, our being the University of Nebraska defensive tackle tandem of Maurice Collins and Vincent Valentine, can be as dominant as Ndamukong Suh and Jared Crick were? And I thought that was a good question, and kind of might lead to an interesting discussion, especially for some of the folks that might listen to this who've been following the sport and specifically the University of Nebraska for a number of years. The quick and easy answer, I believe, is no. I think that we have the potential to have two players that are going to be pretty darn good, and as a tandem will be the best we've had since Ndamukong Suh and Jared Crick were on the team, but they are not going to necessarily come up close to that level. I think Ndamukong Suh was a player that was a transcendent athlete. He was a guy that literally could take over games to some extent. Certainly, people will recall the 2009 Big 12 championship game in which we played Texas, and Ndamukong Suh was pretty much throwing Cody, what was his name, the quarterback at Texas, around like a rag doll, and was pushing people around with one arm. Even though they were trying to double team him, he was just shoving people around. Anyway, I really think that when I compare what these young players we've got now are going to be able to do, I think that they're going to be able to be a dominant group, but not to that level. And Jared Crick was really outstanding and a perfect complement to Ndamukong Suh's power, because Jared was a tremendous tactician and very precise in his techniques, and he was surprisingly strong and kind of long. So
is it Colt McCoy?
Colt McCoy, not
That's
Cody.
it.
Colt McCoy, yes, absolutely. But the question that Steve brought up prompted me to reflect more about Nebraska's defensive tackle history, and how did Ndamukong Suh and Jared Crick even match up to the historic defensive tackle duos of our history, certainly since the time that I began watching it in that late 60s time frame. And the answer, I think, is I certainly Ndamukong and Jared are right up there, but I would actually rank them third. I think there's two groups of defensive tackles that would emerge in my list ahead of Ndamukong. Now, I want to point out very clearly, individually, the most dominant defensive tackle I've ever seen is Ndamukong Suh. Okay,
Yeah.
but as a collection of talent and group, especially among starters and maybe first alternate player, I would put a group of Larry Jacobson and Rich Glover from the '71 team ahead of that group of Ndamukong and Jared. Larry Jacobson and Rich Glover were both All-Americans. They were both physically dominant players for their time. They seemed like monsters out there compared to the guys around them. They were big, tall, square guys that just were had long arms and long reach and just tended to fling people around and just swallow people up. It was really impressive to watch them play. And then not only that, we also had an All-American defensive end by the name of Willie Harper and some other really outstanding young players on that crew that gave them depth and support. So it was an outstanding combination. And then I would also probably have to place our mid-'90s team that we had, which was just absolutely loaded with talent that included both of the Peter brothers, Jason and Christian Peter, at defensive tackle, and a gluttony of outstanding defensive ends in Jared Tomich, Grant Wistrom, Mike Rucker, Kyle Vandenbosch a little later after that, Chad Kelsey. I mean, that whole mid and late 90s time frame had some just phenomenal talent at the defensive end and defensive tackle positions. Terry Keneally, all in that same time frame. So as a collection of talent on any given team, I think they definitely outstripped what was going on in 2008, 2009 with Ndamukong and Jared Crick. Because after that, there wasn't much. Ben Martin, I think, and was maybe the third, and no one would remember him. So based on his play, anyway. So anyway, that's kind of my thoughts on some of that. But it's quite remarkable, actually, when I started kind of jotting down all the players. With Ndamukong Suh, you did have Barry Turner and Pierre Allen, a couple of good defensive ends, and then but going back to the early 1980s, you had the Williams brothers at defensive ends. You had Danny Noonan and Neil Smith in the late to mid 80s. Broderick Thomas, Kenny Walker at defensive tackle, who was a deaf player, who was just an outstanding player, one of the most remarkable athletes I've ever seen. Ended up playing for the Denver Broncos for many years and was phenomenal.
How did he listen to the? Well, I guess
he's a defensive
huddle,
right.
So.
He's a defensive tackle, and they would have special signals for him and all that sort of stuff. There was a person that was put on staff just to help with communication during practice and everything, just for Kenny, and he became an All-American at defensive tackle at Nebraska. Quite a remarkable story. So anyway, but what a great tradition. As I was kind of looking through it and writing down the names, I'm like, wow, we really did. There was a time there in the late 90s when if you had done a summary of, what was defensive end so to speak, the school that was producing the most NFL defensive end, it would have definitely been Nebraska because it was just a whole, continuous flow of great defensive ends coming out of that program. So anyway, some great stuff there, and what a great question. So, and maybe as a teaser for the next podcast, we're going to be talking a little bit more about the upcoming season because at this point we're about 75 days away. We just had Father's Day here, and now we're into the stretch run with conference meetings and kickoff events, and then fall camp will begin here in earnest in early August, which is really only about 5-6 weeks away.
Mm-hmm. That's right. And the final thing we wanted to talk about today was kind of to move it back to the conference-wide discussion, specifically the Big Ten in this case, talking about the national perception of the Big Ten, because remember that before the bowl game season began last year, there was a lot of talk amongst the national media really kind of downplaying the Big Ten and not having really high expectations for us during the bowl season. But then we came out and actually did a lot better than a lot of people were thinking we were going to do in terms of like how many of our teams won or how many of our teams competed on a competitive level with the other teams, even if we lost to those teams in other conferences. And of course the I don't want to say surprising.
No, it was. It's okay. You can call it that.
Surprising win for Ohio State, winning the championship.
I think when the 4 teams of the college football playoff began, Ohio State would have been identified as the 4th seed almost universally everywhere except in the state of Ohio. And And it was absolutely a surprise that they were able to go on a 2-game run and beat in back-to-back games Alabama and then Oregon the way that they did. So it was a surprise. And that's the thing is that up until that point, the national storyline and perception of the conference was that we continued to be the slow plodding conference that still had a long way to go. And then because of this one bowl season, all of a sudden the perceptions began to change. Now the question becomes, how do they sustain that, or can they sustain that? And if you look at the early preseason predictions that are going on now, it would appear that there are 2 teams that most conference or most analysts would say are national championship type contenders, and that would be Ohio State and to a much lesser extent Michigan State. But certainly I would be surprised if Michigan State didn't find themselves in the top 10 in most preseason magazines, and Ohio State will probably be in the top 3 of almost every preseason magazine that comes out. So there's definitely a lot of opportunity there for the Big Ten to make some hay with the gains they were able to make by having a good showing.
Right, and then there's been a lot of publicity for one member of the Big Ten, specifically Michigan in this case, because of the big splash hire they made a few months ago, getting Jim Harbaugh and giving him this enormous contract that has a lot of the national media very excited for what he can do, a coach of his caliber can do with the talent he has at Michigan, which has a lot of people pretty excited for the potential that he brings to Michigan and if he can bring them back to being competitive with Ohio State.
Right.
Although one topic that we did want to address was kind of an interesting dichotomy if you compare Jim Harbaugh, who's a new coach this year within the Big Ten, versus another new college coach within the Big Ten, our own coach Mike Riley for Nebraska. Despite the fact that Riley is much more of a, not lesser higher in terms of talent necessarily, but lesser higher in terms of impact and splash. Yes. You would think that people wouldn't be as wound up about like really expecting championships from him right out of the gate. But Nebraska fans, because we just came off of a series of 7 years with Bo Pelini, where he was winning 9 games every season, a pretty impressive stat if you look at that time frame of coaches and teams during that time period. We're expecting him to do that well or better, versus Jim Harbaugh, who's expected, if he can win 7 or 8 games, people are going to be satisfied with that, Michigan fans and the national media, even though he is the one who's being paid many, many more millions of dollars than Mike Riley.
Right. Well, and it's not just about the money, but it's an interesting thing to listen to the national media basically give Michigan's, their expectation of what Michigan's going to do this year, and seem to be content to say, yeah, if Jim Harbaugh can win 7 or 8 games, then he will have done a good job, and Michigan fans should be happy about that. And even here in Michigan, talking with Michigan fans, generally a lot of them feel the same way, that they seem poised and prepared to have an 8-win season and be okay with it. Whereas because Nebraska, even though we didn't have the greatest relationship with our previous head coach, Bo Pelini, we did witness him winning and finding a way to produce 9 wins every year. And so the idea that our new coach could come in and only win 8 games would be viewed by many within the Nebraska family and frankly nationally as kind of a disappointing season. So it just seems odd and ironic almost that those two can be juxtaposed against each other, and the guy that is going to the larger university with way more money and way more access to athletes and way more talent, if you want to believe all the recruiting numbers that have occurred over the last 5 years, that he is queued up to have way more opportunity to have success than, say, a Mike Riley, and yet the national perception is the opposite. And now a big reason for that, it's called schedule, right? And it gets to the heart of this, which is you begin to look at how the new divisions are kind of laying the land here in the Big Ten, and you have the Big Ten East, which includes in it basically 4 major programs at this point, programs that look to be stable enough and or have enough history that they are likely to be very good football teams going forward for an extended period of time. And those programs, of course, would be Ohio State, Michigan State, and then Michigan and Penn State. And so the question becomes, what happens when they begin to beat each other up, right? And so it's going to be tough to fight through that division. Whereas you look at what Nebraska's going to face in that that Western division, and it's not quite as formidable in name, right? And we are somewhat familiar with this, having come from the Big 12 and the whole Big 12 North versus Big 12 South. Yeah. So we're familiar with that.
Yeah, we discussed this on the previous podcast we did as well, this kind of discrepancy and what kind of advantages and disadvantages that gives to Nebraska in terms of recruiting, but also in terms of making it to the Big Ten championship game and things of that nature.
Win games, etc. But what is interesting is to look at the expectation that they have for Harbaugh. You also have a relatively new coach at PSU in Franklin, and who is doing remarkable things in terms of recruiting and is really restocking that program. And if he's as good a coach as people say he is, and he continues to recruit the way he's going to recruit, they're not going to go away and hide anytime soon. They're going to be another heck of a challenge, and it's going to be a real challenge for Michigan to build its way up through those ranks and get back to the Michigan-Ohio State kind of rivalry, unless they see Michigan State falter. And again, I don't see that happening. I think D'Antonio's established a pretty stable program there, and it looks to be on solid ground. And then you've got Penn State, who's not going away. So the climb's not going to be an easy one, and it's going to be fascinating to watch. And it's one of the exciting things about the sport of college football that we both love is the dynamics of the change. It's always changing, and 3 or 4 years ago, Penn State was a dead football program. There was no way it was going to take them 20 years, people were saying, to reemerge. And I think you may recall I said, no, it won't. I was very confident that the commitment to the program and that the resources at that university, they would find a way. Now, they were helped along the way by NCAA rules to soften their punishment quite substantially, but they also made some great decisions in the hires that they made when they hired Bill O'Brien, and then followed that up with this Franklin fella who is just kind of carried the torch on forward, like they aren't missing a beat. So very impressive what they've been able to accomplish, and it'll just make it interesting to see how that plays out. And I'm very excited about what Mike Riley's doing at Nebraska, and I think he's really come out very organized, very strong in terms of his brand and what he wants to establish at Nebraska. And if he can succeed in putting together the kind of talent that he wants and have some stability on his coaching staff, I'm reasonably confident that Nebraska will emerge as the, or if not the, one of the 2, say, best teams in that Western division. So it'll make for a lot of interesting games.
Didn't you also say that Wisconsin has a new coach this season?
Wisconsin also has a new coach. His name is Paul Christ, and he is actually coming home, so to speak. He played at Wisconsin. He coached at Wisconsin, was the offensive coordinator at Wisconsin, is very entrenched in the Wisconsin way, if you will, going back to Barry Alvarez. And so he is a really good fit for them. And obviously the previous coach, Anderson, wasn't maybe as good a fit because he came in, did some good things, certainly had some success, but wasn't happy and bolted at the first opportunity, in fact, taking Mike Riley's old job. So quite an interesting turn of events, really, and it'll be fascinating to see how quickly Paul Christ is able to put his stamp back on that program.
But I'm just curious, and you may not know this because we haven't been following Wisconsin football that much, but do you know what the expectation for him is? Is he in a Harbaugh situation where, if he wins, 6, 7, 8 games, he's okay, versus a expectation for him to be strong right out of the gate?
Well, I'm going to say to you that knowledgeable fans and the national media are going to be expecting Wisconsin to be in that that 8-win category, and maybe even 9, primarily because they have a fairly easy schedule outside of they have a non-conference game with Alabama early on, and obviously they're expected to lose that game. But the rest of their non-conference schedule and their conference schedule is about as generous of a schedule as they could get. One of their most difficult games, I believe, is going to be playing a game in Lincoln against us. So they don't see Ohio State, they don't see Penn State, I don't believe. So they don't really get a lot of the bigger schools from that western side. So.
All right. Well, I think that wraps up our Big Ten discussion for today and what we wanted to get to for this podcast.
Yeah. Well, and one maybe final note was we talked a little bit about our next podcast. We'll try to focus a little bit more in on the Big Ten and where we think things are going to fall for this year. Kind of do
preseason rankings.
Preseason things, with a caveat that maybe we'll be able to change our minds after fall camps are over, because you never know who's going to get hurt and all those kinds of things that kind of emerge during those 30 practices or so that teams get between the beginning of camp and the first game. But I know the one thing we did want to talk about, and it ties to national perception, is this non-conference season for the Big Ten is huge. You've got the Alabama-Wisconsin game I just mentioned. You've got Oregon playing at Michigan State early in the season. You've got Nebraska going to Miami, at Miami Hurricanes playing in the Orange Bowl. You've got Michigan playing BYU and Utah in the non-conference schedule. Nebraska plays BYU at home in their very first game for Mike Riley. And Ohio State plays Virginia Tech, the only team that beat them last year. So there's a little revenge on that deal, I'm sure. And so there's quite a few national implication type games that are going to be going on this year for the Big Ten, and how they do in those non-conference games is going to become. Minnesota plays TCU also.
That's right.
That's another one.
One.
So there's some big games going on there.
Yeah. Well, that the Alabama game. I mean, I pretty much expect Alabama to win that one. But Michigan State, Oregon, I feel like that could be a very interesting game.
Yes.
Because they've played each other in the past a few times.
I agree.
But we're looking forward to doing episode 3 of the podcast. We're trying to see what sort of schedule we can set up, because we'd like to get this to some sort of, bi-weekly or, have some sort of set schedule so we can have a certain day when we know the podcast is going to come out. But we're still trying to work that out here in the early days of college football throwdown. But as I said before, if you have any questions for us, feel free to email us at huskerpete13@gmail.com. Give us some ratings and reviews on iTunes or Podomatic. Give us any comments if you want to talk to us about what you'd like to see from the podcast in the future.
Or if you don't like what we're talking about, or you have a subject you'd like to add, we'd love to hear from you.
That's right. So thank you very much for listening out there, college football fans, and we will see you next time.